Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Phius Plus 2018, the standard updated webinar. Thank you for joining us for our 1-hour webinar today. We have two presenters on the line. Lisa White, she's the Phius Plus Certification Manager, and we have Graham Wright, Phius Senior Scientist. This is a packed webinar today, so we're hoping to maybe get a few questions in at the end, but if not, what we'll do is we will definitely compile your questions and try to answer them after the webinar. Take a look at the gadget on the right side of your screen. You will see an option to ask a question. That's the way we will be pulling questions today for our webinar. So feel free to use that gadget. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa and Graham. Welcome.
Thanks, Anissa.
Thank you, Anissa. All right, so hi everyone, this is Lisa. As Anissa noted, we're going to talk to you guys today about Phius Plus 2018. We'll have a self-report code for your Phius CPHC CEUs at the end of the presentation, and this also qualifies for an AIA credit. You can go ahead to the next slide, Graham. Okay, so Phius Plus 2018, we're going to express to you that this is a rational exuberance for passive building. And again, it's myself, Lisa White, and Graham Wright talking to you today. Okay, so I just want to start off by giving you guys an update on project certification, where we stand right now. So this was actually updated this morning, so as updated as it could be. What you're seeing here are project counts of square footage over the years. As of 2018, we're at about 5.5 million square feet submitted, and we project to be just over 6 million by the end of the year. And for certified and pre-certified square footage, we're just over 2 million. And we're hoping to be at about 2.5 million square feet. So just as a reminder, submitted is something that's in our project review queue or in process of design, and the certified and pre-certified mean it's either built and fully verified, or it's designed and the energy model is verified in the pre-certification stage. So just a quick plug for certification. Why do you certify? Probably one of the biggest things is it shares the knowledge of how to do this. So in the certification program, we get new inquiries every single day. And what we do is we develop new protocol to align with these inquiries and determine best practice, and then we share that outward. So we're not, everyone doesn't need to reinvent the wheel every time. So we're trying to share that knowledge. And then also, really importantly, is it shares that something's happening. So if everyone was designing, high performance buildings and passive buildings, but not actually certifying, we wouldn't really have any proof of existence there or any kind of momentum in the movement. So it's really picking up quite a bit, and we're quite happy with the progress that we've made since Phius 2015 was released. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Graham, and I'll start with an overview of the talk today, and I want to first start by remembering kind of what's at the heart of this passive building idea, but then we'll move on to what's the architecture of and the principles that underlie our standard itself, and how we set the performance criteria, and then we'll wrap up with some view to the future and zoom back out to the big picture again. So what's at the heart of this, my definition of what passive building is about is really about using passive measures to crush the heating and cooling loads in a building, both the peak and the annual. So that's greatly reducing both the energy bills and the required capacity of the heating and cooling systems. So it's the furnace-free house, right? Let's not pay for heat. Why are we paying for heat? Or I could heat my house with a hairdryer or candles if I had to. So that's really the gut level appeal of what we're talking about here. And a lot of motivation for that came from the energy crisis in the 1970s. And one of the first ideas that people had was well, let's design for a lot of solar gain. And that required a pretty significant architectural response. But then there was sort of a splinter idea that formed off of that, which was originally called micro-load passive house. And that changed the emphasis to, well, what about instead of going for so much gain, what if we reduce the heat losses first instead? And that led us to our now beloved kit of measures, which is the super insulation, the air sealing, the heat recovery, ventilation, and yes, still some passive solar gain, but not quite as radical architecturally. We don't necessarily need that wedge of cheese architecture. And so a point from this is that sustainability really has been a big part of the motivation for this since the 1970s. But we now understand that we've got just as much of a problem with pollution as we do with energy depletion, maybe even more. They've went and found a lot of gas, but now we have this climate change concern.
And we found that passive building really has been a bit of a magic bullet, at least for space conditioning. So passive measures can do what they can, and I think Graham will talk through that, what they can and can't do. But for space conditioning, it's been a magic bullet. It provides benefits to all parties. There's comfort, health, and energy savings to the occupants. There's cost savings. There's indoor air quality. But what we've determined is that energy targets alone don't promise those benefits. So that's why we also have prescriptive quality assurance requirements and checklist items that align with the US Department of Energy, because the numbers alone aren't foolproof. And Graham will get into what those are. So these quality assurance elements safeguard the benefits that passive building sets up for you, but doesn't guarantee on its own. Again, just putting a number out there in KBTUs doesn't ensure comfort in a building, doesn't ensure high indoor air quality. So that's why we kind of have this performance and prescriptive based path. And then in general, the basic purpose of writing any standard is, or what we're trying to do for you all, is to guide you toward good solutions, and maybe even more importantly, help avoid any pitfalls in design. So okay, so what you're seeing here is just, again, another snapshot of kind of the past here and showing the program and how it's worked out. So on the x-axis here, you see project numbers, and each of these is measured in modeled EUIs, site EUIs. We could have done source, it would have looked the same, just multiplied by a factor of about 3. So the modeled number here is the dark blue chart, and the measured EUI is the red. If you see multiple red, that means we have multiple years of data. What we're finding here is that we're very close on most projects between modeled data and measured data, so we're pretty happy about that. But then, of course, there are outliers. So we have the average of all of these buildings as those dotted lines in the middle. The average modeled EUI is 16.5. This is KBTU per foot square per year, and the average measured is 17.7. So overall, our modeled results are just 7% under what's actually happening. So this is really proof of concept. You know, an energy model can say whatever it wants, but it's really how does the building perform? And then most importantly, probably, is the typical residential energy consumption is about 38 from the residential energy consumption of 2015. So we're at about half of that for our measured EUIs for passive buildings. So this is really proof of concept and showing that this is working. And the general concept of passive building appeals to many people. It makes sense, right? So many have mentioned, how do we get this into code? At Phius, a shorter version of our mission statement is we'd like to make high performance passive building commonplace. And so of course, if it was code, then it would be. But what we're lacking right now is more from public policy. We need more resolution to cut CO2 emissions, get rid of fossil fuel imports, stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure, etc. But from our end of things, we also need a call for the building sector to contribute to these goals. It's not just about adding renewable energy. We also have a responsibility to conserve and cut demand. So that's really where building energy code comes in for us. And luckily, people are doing this.
Right. There is some fertile ground in the policy front that's developing.
So many cities and states have set these goals. Just a couple news headlines from the last year. People don't need the national support. People still care about climate action, achieving 80% reduction by 2050, setting goals to fight climate change. In this last one, 19 global cities commit to making new buildings net zero by 2030. That is a huge commitment. And Phius really aims to be, or Phius Plus 2018, we believe can be the path for these cities to use to meet their carbon reduction targets.
Right. Thanks, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
So it occurred to me that there are a few key questions that you might want a standard to address. And those would be, well, when should you stop investing in passive measures? How much insulation is enough, kind of thing. And then, well, when would you stop investing in conservation, period? Whether it's passive measures or mechanical systems, and turn to renewables instead. And then beyond that, when has the building done all it can with both conservation and on-site renewables, and has to look to its energy suppliers for clean or renewable energy? And so Phius Plus has answers to those questions, and we hope to convince you that we're getting this right, and to be clear about what passive building per se can and can't do.
So with introducing Phius 2018, we'd like to reach out to all perspectives today. In the simplest form, we have kind of the pioneers of the passive building movement, the enthusiasts that got really fired up about no heating bills, right? So we want to reach you. We also want to reach those that are looking for tools to meet policy goals for sustainability or resilience. And lastly, we want to reach those that genuinely believe passive building is the right thing to do. Everyone kind of has different motives for this, whether it's comfort, health, resilience, social justice, whatever it may be. We'd like to reach you as well.
Right. So on to the architecture of the standard piece. So it's still what we call a 3-pillar standard. So we've got heating and cooling performance criteria. That's really the distinguishing feature. But we also care about overall energy use. So we have an overall source energy use criterion, and also the third-party verification of the quality assurance and commissioning requirements. That's the third. So it's still a pass-fail standard. So that sets it up pretty well for being, like a REACH code or something like that. And when it comes to the heating and cooling performance criteria, those are really tied to a concept of economic feasibility. We want to be economically rational about how much we're investing in the passive measures per se. And what's new for 2018 on that front is some sensitivity to building size and occupancy. We added the climate sensitivity in 2015, and now we're making that more nuanced. The overall source energy use criterion, though, that's not really tied to economics. That's a we've got to do it kind of thing. We're under a global CO2 emission cap, basically, according to the IPCC science, to the climate science, and so we really should be in terms of net carbon emissions, we should be on a glide path to zero, and so we're we're changing the metric in 2018. We're to put it on that glide path. So we're making an increase in stringency, but we're now recognizing that offsite renewables do have a role to play. So you don't have to do it all with on-site PV. And then on the quality assurance front, we are adding some additional requirements for non-residential buildings for commissioning of those. And so we tend to mention that quality and commissioning pillar third all the time, but in a way it's really the most important. So today I'll talk about it first. And a lot of this carries over from 2015. We, of course, have our requirement on whole building air tightness. You have to pass an air tightness test. We also want to make sure that we don't put anything harmful into our buildings that's going to pollute the indoor air. So we require EPA Indoor Air Plus. This has restrictions on materials. You can't use building cavities as ducts, this kind of thing. And we also have the Department of Energy's Energy Star and Zero Energy Ready Home programs as prerequisites, and this is a lot of quality prescriptive items, water management checklist, you have to put the ducts inside, this kind of thing. And we recognize that in the process of doing super insulation, you do reduce the energy flow through your assemblies, and that can make them more vulnerable to moisture damage. The air tightness helps a lot with that, but we also want to make sure that the vapor control is making sense and that we're preventing any condensation on our windows as well. And we want to make sure that our very important balanced ventilation is hooked up and blowing the right way, this kind of thing. And kind of the way that our partners at the Department of Energy look at this is that there's a high performance staircase, and Phius is building on the requirements of Energy Star and the IECC codes and the Zero Energy Ready Home program. And then if your site is suitable, you can get a Phius Plus badge also for Source Zero. So on that non-residential commissioning, so the new part of that, that will encompass the LEED requirements for basic level commissioning to support people that are interested in dual certification there. The tech committee has figured out who we want for providers. Let me see, I think CPMP is commissioning protocol professional, and the first two of those I believe are ASHRAE credentials, and then the ACG is from the Air Balance Council. And the procedures have to follow one of the more prominent standards, and there's a bit more detail under each one of these, but the scope of the requirements includes all of these items, and kind of the theme there is it is sort of focused on things that have to do with energy. So on to the heating and cooling, on to the space conditioning. And so as I mentioned, the idea is we want low heating bills and small system sizes as much as possible. So we just set up the criteria that way. The annual heating and cooling demands have to be less than a certain number, and the peak heating load peak cooling load by design has to be less than some other number. And you have to meet all 4 of those criteria. And in 2015, what we did is we made those targets climate sensitive. This graphic here shows some climate zones in different color bands, but the actual criteria vary continuously based on climate factors. So there's no actual zone boundaries in the final protocol for 2018. And again, if you have low annual demands, that makes sure that you're actually saving energy and money. And if you have low peak loads, that's what delivers the resilience and the reduced mechanical sizes. Let's see. Okay. So how do we set those 4 heating and cooling criteria targets? What we do is a big computer experiment, a numerical experiment. So we picked out 5 different building sizes, ranging in size from about 1,000 square feet to about 80,000 square feet. And we're going to look at each one of those at 3 different occupancy levels, a low, medium, and high occupancy. So we've got 15 base buildings. And we're going to look at each of those in 20 different climates. And energy prices also being varied there as well. And so for each one of those 300 cases, then we're going to do a life cycle cost optimization. And I might just, next slide. Okay. So what's going to happen there is so med-occ is from the National Renewable Energy Lab, a software for building energy optimization. And what it does is it runs building energy simulations, and it uses the Energy Plus engine to do that. And the med-occ program itself, what it's going to do is you give it a number of options to play with in terms of energy saving upgrades, and it's going to try a bunch of different ones and try and find a minimum in the annualized energy related costs. So what it's going to try and do is pick a package of energy saving upgrades that minimizes the sum of the utility bills plus the finance cost of the upgrades. So as you put more energy saving measures in there, you are reducing your utility bills, but the amortized cost of those upgrades is going up. So at some point there's an optimum, a minimum total life cycle cost. In the process of doing that, we're going to enforce, we're not going to just sort of let it try anything. We're going to enforce some mandatory minimums on it corresponding to the air tightness requirements and the duct inside types of requirements that are part of our program anyway. And once we've got those solutions for all those cases, we have to remodel those in WUFI Passive, because that's the software that we're actually using for certification. And there's some differences in method which make a difference to the results, so we have to do that crossover. Then we do a statistical smoothing. So we're going to take those results and we're going to curve fit them to the climate factors, the occupant density, and the building envelope to floor area ratio. We're going to do separate fits, separate curve fits, multi-factor regressions for each of those 4 different criteria that we have. At the end of that, we have formulas to figure out the targets based on those climate factors and building size and so forth. And we go ahead and set up a handy calculator then so that you can just get the answer. You can just put in your city and it looks up the climate data, figures out the targets, And what that looks like is this. So again, the new part for 2018 is that the targets vary based on size and occupant density. So there's sliders for that. And then when you pick the location, that's what's pulling out the climate data and the energy price data. So there's a couple of examples on this slide for, so that in this case, the climate location is the same, the occupant density is the same, and what's changing is the building size. So on the left is a small building, so it has a high ratio of envelope to floor area. On the right is a larger building, which has a lower ratio of envelope to floor area ratio. And you can see that that this reflects the fact that it actually gets relatively easier when you have a larger building to get rid of your heating and cooling loads. And the smaller building gets a bit of a break. A 2.9, that's a fairly small building. That's a smaller than average house, I would say. Whereas the 1.3, that would be getting into like a townhouse or something like that, maybe a little bigger. And so, yeah, just to give you a visual on the buildings the study buildings that we used. On the upper left there, we've got about 1,000 square feet, little 2-story house. That's interior floor area, and then about a 1,800 square foot house. In the lower left, in the lower right, then we step up to an 8 or 16 unit townhouse. In the lower left, we go up to about a 30,000 square foot 4-story mid-rise, and then we do a 10-story high-rise. And the larger of those two buildings are based on the Department of Energy commercial prototype designs. And so for this list of runs where we're looking to explore this parameter space of climate factors, so depending on which response, which criterion we're concerned with, whether it's an annual heat demand or a peak cooling load, the number of relevant factors varies a bit. So we've got 5 to 7 dimensions in this parameter space that we need to explore. And so the basic idea is to generate a space filling experiment design that sort of sprinkles points evenly through that space. But we have a bit of an issue because some of those climate factors are actually a bit correlated with each other. So, for example, the cooling degree days and the irradiance global annual, the solar radiation, are they're somewhat positively correlated with each other because they both have a lot to do with the latitude of the location. And so what we do is we find best matches amongst the actual climate locations. And what that tends to do is if there's a point sort of that doesn't physically exist, a place with very high solar radiation but low cooling degree days, that just might not exist. But we find the closest match to it that we can. And so we had about 1,040 climate locations that we have data for available to choose from for our 300 runs. and we ended up with 137 unique locations chosen. So some of those climate locations then are studied with multiple buildings. And again, the idea is that for each of those cases, b-opt is trying different things, and it's looking for a minimum total cost in terms of the minimizing the sum of the utility bills and the mortgage payment. So here's a specific example. So this is a medium-sized house, so a single-family typical house, medium occupancy in Iowa. That's like climate zone 5A, I think, and pretty moderate electricity or typical electricity price. So this is an actual example of one of those energy cost versus energy savings graphs that b-opt is calculating. So on the left axis we have that total annualized cost, the utilities bills plus the finance cost of the upgrades, and the point there on the left is where we start with. So b-opt always uses a benchmark case. It always does savings relative to a benchmark, and that's the Building America benchmark, which is essentially the IECC code circa 2009. So our starting point in this case, our benchmark is $4,000 a year for this house. And so what b-opt is doing then is when we give it different upgrade options to try, different levels of insulation and windows and heat recovery ventilators and air conditioning devices and all these kinds of things, it's gonna try different combinations, and the result of each of those combinations is a point in gray on the scatter plot there. So each combination is going to give some amount of energy savings at some cost, and so it generates this cloud of possibilities. And they essentially define the bottom edge of that cloud as what they call the optimal path to zero. So clearly we want to go down and to the right on this graph. We want more energy savings, which is going to the right, and we want to save money at the same time, and that's going down. So so you can see there's a pretty big jump from the starting point at the reference on the left over to the first point on the optimal path, and that's our mandatory minimums coming into play. And from there, b-opt is going to go ahead and pick some low-hanging fruit first. So as we study the results and move our way down this optimal path, we're essentially picking low-hanging fruit first. At some point, you can pick measures that still save more energy, but you start giving back on cost. So the cost starts going back up. And at some point, b-opt is also, this by the way is net source energy, net of PV, on-site PV generation. And that's what that last big jump is there. That's when we're into picking the high-hanging fruit, and in terms of net source energy savings, the best thing to do is to just start buying PV and offsetting it, and going all the way to net zero. And in this case, the only option that it was given was to put a solar array that would fit on the entire roof, and so that actually blew through 100% savings. So that's 100% source energy savings is net zero, source net zero, and so that big of an array would actually overperform in that sense. And so the minimums that we enforce are mostly to do with the envelope, but there are some other things. So we definitely enforce our air tightness. We definitely put the duct inside, and we insist on a window upgrade, and a pretty stringent one, so as to keep the that's to protect the comfort promise. We want to make sure that the inside surface temperature is nice on the windows. So in this climate, yeah, it actually requires a 0.13 window or better. And so that's the first big jump there. In this life cycle analysis, we use quite conventional assumptions. We use a project life or building life of 70 years. We found some pretty good data on that, and the escalation rates and interest rates and all that are quite conventional. So essentially, what's going on here is those mandatory minimums, those constraints we put on the optimization. That's what's expressing our exuberance for passive building. But doing the life cycle cost analysis, that's the rational part of it. And so this is those minimums we enforce. That's how we give it the heart. That's how we give it a passive house heart. And this life cycle analysis is how we use our head and make sure that we're not requiring absurdities to do that. And in terms of the energy savings, this is kind of typical result here. So we start out with that 2009 code minimum benchmark, and yep, we scrunch the heating and cooling down to where it's not that much bigger than the other end uses, and we do some good for the other end uses too with the Energy Star appliances and lighting upgrades and things. And so we also made our own analyzer workbook or spreadsheet to look at those at that cost versus energy savings, and this workbook looks through the detailed reports that BOCC spits out and actually keeps track of what that initial cost is, the initial cost premium in dollars per square foot. And in 2015, when we were sort of just looking at that source energy versus cost curve, we said, well, we could push past the straight up minimum cost point there. We could get a little bit more savings and not give back a lot on cost. And our motivation for doing that was, well, if we push a little bit harder, we can get those peak loads. Sometimes we can get those peak loads down even more. So it's even more passive. But we noticed that not all the time, but fairly frequently the minimum cost on the life cycle sense was an inflection point in the initial cost. Like as soon as you passed the minimum cost point on a life cycle basis, the initial costs started to ramp up really pretty steeply, and so that's a reason for not pushing past that minimum cost point. So for 2018, we didn't do any hand tuning in the picking of the optimal packages. We just took the straight up minimum cost point, and that recognizes that, well, yes, on a rational basis, a 2% discount rate is sensible from a business perspective, but there's a kind of an extreme form of discounting that's psychological, where people really do care a lot about the initial cost as well. So it's important to notice that in terms of percentage savings, the opportunity really varies there. So here we have a pretty small house. So yeah, a small building would be quite sensitive to its climate, but it happens to be in Chula Vista in San Diego, where there's hardly any heating and cooling load to start with. So in terms of climate action, in terms of like overall energy savings, the game is mostly not in the heating and cooling. It's going to be in hot water and in throwing renewables on the roof. And yeah, PV works really well in San Diego. So let's look at a townhouse. So here's a townhouse in Chicago. And this again is still pretty heating dominated. So the heating, which is in the red here, that's the largest single end use. And yep, we can get rid of most of that, and we can do some good for the cooling as well, which is this blue. And we're in terms of so this is plausibly passive, but we're in the black. We're in the money in doing that, saving $14,000 a year. But what if we go bigger? What if we look at what about a low occupancy mid-rise in zone 3? So this is actually pretty balanced in terms of its heating and cooling, and we can again pretty easily get rid of most of the annual heating demand. We can do a little bit of good for cooling still, but the mandatory minimums almost took care of it. There wasn't a whole lot much more to do. And the other thing you notice here is that that upward sloping line for the PV array, that's gone now in this plot. And so what happens there? So there's something I haven't mentioned about these PV arrays that we're putting on, which are beating out the high hanging fruit, and that is that the cost of those was fake. That's $15 a watt PV, and out in the market these days, it's getting down to more like $3 or $4 a watt. So what happens when you make PV what happens in this analysis when you make PV cheaper and cheaper is that the slope of this line gets more shallow, and it starts to take off earlier. It starts to beat out more and more conservation measures. And if you make PV free, it would beat out everything. You would do nothing but PV. And if you make it very cheap, it beats out almost everything. And this is a flaw in thinking. There's a structural problem with this analysis. And what it's missing really is that the timing is all wrong, really. For if your largest end use is heating, PV is bad at that. It doesn't match up on a seasonal basis or on a daily basis. You can't heat your house with PV. So the flaw in this analysis is that it's treating this offset of PV, kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour. It's not sensitive at all to the differences in hour or season. So essentially, what we decided to do was ignore PV for the purpose of setting the space conditioning targets. We're going to leave it out of the analysis. We're just going to look at the diminishing returns behavior of the conservation measures. And so our beloved passive measures then are competing with other conservation measures like water heater upgrades and mini split upgrades, but they're not competing with PV. So let's look at another case here. So this is, let's look at a high rise now. This is a high rise. We're back in Iowa with the thing. And it's still heating dominated, and we can get rid of most of the heating demand. But notice that we're now in a little bit of a trade-off with cooling. We're saving energy overall, but we had to let the cooling ride up a little bit. That was the optimal solution. And again, the mandatory minimums took care of most of it. There wasn't a whole lot left to do after that. Maybe a water heating upgrade. And again, with this big of a building, space conditioning altogether is maybe only just barely the largest end use to start with, versus this 2009 benchmark. Different story, by the way, with retrofit. Those tend to be quite a bit worse than this 2009 benchmark. So for retrofit, there's more of a scope for passive measures to really do, or to do a lot of good. So the other thing that I haven't mentioned is that in the study we did relax that window comfort constraint for the mid-rise and the high-rise building, and this was based on feedback we got from the pilot program that when we enforced that constraint on the study buildings, the resulting criteria were too tight. People just really pushed back on that, and so we said, okay, like in the study for those larger sizes of buildings, we're going to relax that constraint back to just code minimum. We'll go ahead and give it. We'll go ahead and give the optimizer the option to do the full comfort constrained window, but we won't require it. And so in compensation for that, so we still want to protect our comfort promise for Passive House. So we added a requirement in certification then, which we didn't have before. In the past, we did have a requirement on the window performance for condensation resistance, but that was relatively easy to meet. We're now going to add a comfort-based requirement on the window U value as well. And really the concern there is about the phenomenon of the cold air pooling under the windows. The radiant temperature effect is not quite as bad, but what's really more constraining is if you have a big tall window and the cold air falls off of it, pools at the bottom and makes people's ankles cold. That's unpleasant. And so that criterion, that constraint on the windows for in certification, that's going to depend on the climate and the window height. And to just go ahead and, so at the conference time, we didn't have that all dialed in yet, but now we do. And so this is the rule. Basically, so the original idea, or what we've been teaching in our training, is that you should really have no more than a 4 degree C difference between your indoor air temperature and your window inside surface temperature. The indoor surface temperature of the window shouldn't be more than 4 degrees C colder than the air, or 7.2 F. So we're now going to impose that basically. So that's pretty much the requirement still for a 10-foot tall window. But the shorter the window it is, you can let that temperature difference get a little larger because it doesn't produce. The shorter the window is, it doesn't produce as much of this cold air pooling effect. And there are some exceptions for ADA doors and for areas that aren't regularly occupied. And Lisa's put together a handy calculator, a handy online calculator that now calculates for both our window condensation requirement and this new comfort requirement. And so again, you just pick your location. You still do have to look up the ASHRAE design temperature. So we're using ASHRAE 99% design temperature for both condensation risk and for the comfort requirement. That's not built into this yet, so you do have to look that up and put it in. But the climate data for the moisture and for the condensation, that part is built in. Okay, so just back to our examples here, and looking at a case that's really in a straight up cooling dominated climate. There's no heating at all. So passive measures can still make sense or can help these types of buildings. I believe this one did buy a couple of upgrades. I think it did put in a heat recovery ventilator and a window upgrade, maybe some overhangs even. So having got all of our 300 cases run and crossed over in Woofy Passive, we have all our upgrade packages picked out for these buildings, and we have the heating and cooling loads that resulted from that. So now we're going to do this curve fitting. And this isn't as complicated as it looks. Basically, there's there's some terms that are proportional to the factors themselves, and then terms proportional to the quadratics of those, and to some two-way interactions. And so this is just an example plot of what the sensitivities look like for the annual heating demand, how that depends on the floor area ratio. Oh my gosh, yeah, we're low on time. All right, all right. I'll try to speed this up. Okay. So the curve fitting worked out pretty well. You know, the R squared of 0.88 to 0.92. There is some, you know, there is still some scatter. You know, we can only adjust the upgrades in sort of steps. You know, add an inch or two of insulation, step up the ERV from 70 to 80. So there's quantization, which makes this lumpy. And so so this is our answer. So these heating and cooling criteria, this is our answer for when do you stop with the passive measures. And the idea is you stop at this life cycle cost optimum, subject to these mandatory minimums, and that the passive measures are competing with mechanical upgrades, but not with PV. You know, just to compare and contrast that with some other ideas that we've heard of, you know, we think it's better than these other approaches. You know, you might have heard recommendation from Building Science Corp to build like 20, 40, 60 everywhere. That, you know, I don't think that makes sense for that little house in Chula Vista. So Chris Benedict and Henry Gibson, they proposed, well, what if we just put limits on the heating and cooling system size? And that's pretty close to what we're proposing. We still care about the annual demands. They were really trying to get rid of energy modeling, but I think there's really no escape from that. Even if you're basing it on system size, you still have to do a load calc, so that's still an energy model. And I think our method of determining how low to go is better than what they proposed, which was just to sort of benchmark what's out there and tighten it by 15%. The straight up limited peak load to the supplier heating sufficient level. We talked a lot about that in 2015, and the short story there is that you know, in these mid-continent climates where those peak design temperatures for heating are so harsh or so low that it really violates the promise of economic optimality that doesn't come true in climates like that. You know, another rule that we sometimes come across is like in a utility perspective. Well, we're going to invest in conservation only if it's cheaper than generation. Similarly to my PV discussion there, you don't necessarily get the most robust building stock that way. We think we've got a better idea of how far to go with that, even if it costs more than generation. And you also don't necessarily want to do just sort of a uniform percent reduction, you know, from some historical benchmark. You really, I think it's clear from the examples that I showed that you really have to look at what's the opportunity, you know, what's the opportunity for savings, and that varies by climate. and building type. All right, so we'll go through the. I'll try and hurry through the source energy stuff then. So the other question, so that's sort of our answer. What I talked about up to this point was, so what's our answer for how much to invest in passive measures, how low to go with that, with the heating and cooling. When it comes to this question of when to stop with conservation in any sense, conservation on anything, and turn to on-site renewables, we decided not to answer that. We changed our metric, and so what instead we answer is, when has the building done all it can with both the conservation and the on-site renewables, and has to look to its energy suppliers. And so, but just in terms of just, FYI, in terms of what, about where we would come out in terms of site energy use intensity, this is from the, this is looking at all the study building cases, and those would be in about this range. And the biggest factor was occupancy there. The high occupancy ones use more energy because there's just occupant dependent assumptions on plug loads and lighting mainly that make a lot of difference. And so our criterion then is based on a net source energy, and this is based on a carbon budget type of thinking. So the idea is we look at the global carbon budget. We give the building sector its traditional, like 1/3 share of that, and taper that to zero over a period of time, and we just divide by the number of people, and we get a per person number out of that. So these slides kind of walk through the math on that, and so we're bypassing any discussion of nationally determined targets or anything like that, and just looking directly at the climate science for this. So our first step down limits the net source energy to these values, depending on whether it's residential or non-residential. But you can use any on-site generation or any of these options for off-site in order to offset and get that job done. There are some additional provisos. You can't sell RECs off of your PV array, but fortunately, that source factor for grid electricity did drop. We caught a break there. The Energy Star portfolio manager updated in August, and so the source energy factor for electricity has dropped for both dropped a lot for the U.S. and a bit for Canada.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So I'm Lisa, jumping back in here just to outline the timeline. We did see a lot of questions in the question panel. Because we're a little over, we probably won't get through any, but I think most have been addressed, or at least a handful addressed in what Graham discussed and in our following slides. So timeline, the Phius Plus 2018 was fully released at our conference this past September, and the pilot phase has ended in October. And now until the end of March 2019, you are able to submit a project under 2015 or 2018, Phius 2015 or Phius Plus 2018. In order to do that, essentially you just need to sign and send a contract to Phius for project certification. So we're going on that contract date that is on your project certification contract. You don't need to pay the fee. You don't need to get the project reviewed or certified by any date. It's specifically what the contract date states. So if your project isn't fully certified, but you have the contract with us right now, it can be certified technically under Phius Plus 2015 in the future. And then after April 1st, all new projects must certify under Phius Plus 2018. And then it's just something for everyone to be aware of. Only WUFI Passive is accepted for Phius Plus 2018. We had allowed versions of PHPP in the past, but we are just diverging quite a bit, and we're just using WUFI Passive. There will be a new version of WUFI Passive coming out, probably by the end of the year, if not early next year. We will be sure to announce that to everybody. It will include features for Phius Plus 2018, notably a new shading algorithm, but quite a bit of other features as well. So again, that'll come out before the end of the year. Some people have asked if the slides would be posted online. Yes. And then I think we can go to the next slide, Graham. You can find some resources here for a lot of the questions. I think they were answered in these 3 documents. So this is our webpage. Under the certification for buildings and products, there is a Phius Plus 2018 Getting to Zero page. It has kind of an overview here, but then these green buttons on the side talk about energy modeling protocol related to the standard, some more standard setting documentation that defines some of the terms Graham outlined as well that some had questions about. And then also that condensation and comfort assessment calculator for Windows is linked on that page. So use that as a resource.
All right. So just a few concluding remarks here. So I feel like we're on pretty firm ground with this general approach with the life cycle cost optimization for setting the heating and cooling standards. But we're not done. There are some opportunities for further improvement, and we want to keep coming up with better planning tools to get you to the right designs as fast as possible. So we do still have some things we want to work on there. We want to revisit the peak load calculation to make it more directly useful for system sizing. We would like to come up with options for people that have both more and less planning resources than what it takes to make a WUFI passive model. We would like to address this issue of grid citizenship, or the idea of replacing this straight sort of net zero energy accounting with a metric that's more sensitive to seasonality, and we know that NBI is working on that. And of course, if we're going to really scale this up and build a lot of passive buildings, which are not going to have too much operating energy, then most of their CO2 impact comes from doing the retrofit itself. And so we have to be mindful of that and make sure that we do our retrofitting process in as low emission way as possible. And a lot of that has to do with the global warming potential of the materials. We understand that MIT is working on a handy little tool there, and there's also things like the embodied carbon network that are looking at it. And so a lot of people did contribute to the development of this. In terms in terms of the the climate change, it can be discouraging to listen to the news, and you might be getting the idea that, well, it could be game over for 1.5 or even 2 degrees C. But my perspective is that game is never over. The game that we're talking about is the continuation of civilization and multicellular life on the planet. So anything we can do, anything we can do to blunt the impact of that is helpful. That game is not ever over. And the good thing about passive building is that it's both a sword and a shield. It does mitigation and adaptation, right? If you build passive, you're cutting emissions and suffocating this climate change monster. But you're also building yourself a robust shelter that will protect you from his hammer blows of extreme weather. Again, to our early adopters and true believers, this is catching on, and you're not out there alone anymore by yourselves. There is an army coming on up behind you. So sorry for going over, and please email your additional questions to certification. And here is your self-report code.
Thank you, Lisa and Graham, for the very informative webinar. As Graham and Lisa both had mentioned, the webinar is worth 1 CPHC CEU and 1 AIA LU HSW. You can visit our self-report page, type in this verification code to get that credit, as well as the AIA credits will be reported internally. So if you supplied your AIA number, Phius will be reporting it for you. If you're looking forward to seeing Phius again soon, if you're in the Chicagoland area, I'm going to send a link right now in our chat box. We are going to be at the Greenbuild International Conference, November 14th through 16th. You'll be able to see Phius's booth there, as well as hear from Lisa Wright again on the 14th and the 16th if you take a look at the session schedule. Stay tuned for upcoming webinars. If you're interested in subscribing to our newsletter, I also sent a link above as well. And as Lisa and Graham had mentioned, if your question has not been answered, you can email certification at passivehouse.us, or we also have compiled your questions to possibly do a follow-up Q&A that will be available on our website. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you in another webinar. Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.
Thank you.